Okay, Jack, let's start our today's challenge. I want to ask our listeners a question. So, guys, have you ever opened your mouth to answer a simple question in English and felt like your brain took a long trip through your first language before any words came out? You knew the answer, you understood everything, but somewhere between hearing the question and speaking your reply, something slowed you down. That small delay, that quiet moment of searching is something almost every English learner knows very well.
Yes, friends. Today we are going to talk about why it happens, what it actually costs you in real conversations, and one simple shift that can make your English come out faster and much more naturally.
Welcome back to Rose and Jack Everyday English. We're so happy you're here. I hope yesterday's episode helped you a little bit with your English speaking practice. Today is day 15 of our 30-day B1 to B2 challenge, and our topic today is Stop Translating, Speak English Naturally Every Day. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand exactly why translating in your head slows you down, and you'll feel much more confident having a real English conversation without stopping to translate every single word.
Okay, Rose, I have to start with something that still makes me a little embarrassed, even though it happened years ago. Do you remember when I told you about my first serious job interview in English? It was for a position at an international logistics company, and I had prepared so much. I practiced answers in front of the mirror, I wrote out my whole work history, I even prepared jokes.
I remember you telling me about this, but tell everyone the actual story because I think a lot of our listeners are going to recognize themselves in it.
So I walk into this interview, and the woman interviewing me asks a very normal question. She says, "Tell me about a time you solved a difficult problem at work." And in my head, I hear the question in English, but then, without even deciding to, my brain jumps straight into my first language. I start building the whole answer in my own language first, choosing the perfect words, thinking about grammar, and only after all of that, I try to translate it back into English, word for word.
And how long did that take?
Way too long. There was this silence, maybe 4 or 5 seconds, which does not sound like much, but in an interview, 5 seconds of silence feels like an hour. The interviewer was clearly waiting, and I could feel my face getting warm. When I finally spoke, my sentence came out stiff because I was literally translating my own language structure into English, and it did not sound like natural English at all. It sounded like a sentence that had been squeezed through a machine.
I completely understand that feeling. Something almost the same thing happened to me, actually, but in a different situation. Mine was a video call interview for a marketing position, and I remember thinking I was so ready because I had practiced my introduction so many times. But then the interviewer asked something I had not prepared for. She asked, "What would you do if a client was unhappy with a campaign result?" And just like you, my mind ran straight back to my mother tongue first. Exactly. And the strange thing is, I actually knew every single word I needed in English. I was not missing vocabulary. The problem was the process. I was translating instead of thinking directly in English, and that translating step added all this extra time and made me sound hesitant, even nervous, even though I actually knew the answer perfectly well.
That is such an important point because a lot of learners think their problem is vocabulary, when really the problem is the habit of translating everything first.
Right, and here's the part I still think about. After that interview, I went home and I kept replaying it in my head, feeling frustrated with myself. I remember telling my flatmate at the time, "I know English, I just cannot speak it fast enough." And she said something that actually changed how I practiced from that day forward. She said, "Maybe the problem is not speed. Maybe the problem is that you are speaking two languages at once inside your head."
That is such a good way to put it, speaking two languages at once.
Exactly. So instead of translating, I needed to picture the situation directly in English and just answer directly, even if my sentence was not perfect, even if I made small grammar mistakes.
For me, the moment everything changed was actually a small conversation, not a big interview. It was a few months later and I was living abroad for work, and I went to a small restaurant near my apartment. I wanted to order something, and normally before I would think about my order in my own language first, then translate it in my head before speaking to the waiter. But that evening, I was tired and honestly a little lazy, so I just looked at the menu and said the first natural English sentence that came to my mind, without translating anything first.
What did you say?
I just said, "Could I get the chicken with a side of rice, please, and no vegetables today?" Simple sentence, nothing special, but what surprised me was how relaxed I felt saying it because there was no pause, no searching, no translating step in between. It came out the same way a thought comes out, quick and direct.
And did you notice that feeling continue?
I did, actually. That same week, I had a longer conversation with a coworker about a project delay, and instead of building the answer in my head first, I just tried to think directly in English pictures and situations, not words from my own language. It was not perfect, my grammar still had mistakes, but I did not freeze up anymore, and the conversation felt so much more like a real conversation, not a translation exercise.
That is such a good example because I think a lot of learners believe that thinking in English means knowing every grammar rule perfectly first. But really, thinking in English is more about connecting the situation directly to English words without that middle step of your first language.
Exactly. And once you notice that middle step, translating, you start to see how much time and confidence it steals from you in everyday English conversation.
I actually started practicing this on purpose after my interview experience. Every morning while I made my coffee, I would describe what I was doing directly in English in my head. I am pouring the water. I am waiting for it to boil. Small, simple sentences, but I never let myself translate first. I just tried to see the action and say the English words for it right away.
Did that feel strange at first?
So strange, honestly. At the beginning, it felt slower than translating because I was building a new habit. But after maybe 2 or 3 weeks, something clicked, and I noticed I was reacting faster in real conversations too, not just during my coffee practice.
That matches something I noticed too. The more I practiced small everyday moments directly in English, ordering food, describing my day, giving simple opinions, the easier bigger conversations became, like meetings or interviews.
It makes sense because those small daily moments are actually training your brain to build the connection between real life and English directly, instead of building the connection between real life and your first language and then a second connection from your first language into English.
I like that explanation. Two connections instead of one. No wonder it felt exhausting before.
Exactly. And I think that is why so many learners feel tired after speaking English for even a short time, because they are doing double the mental work without even realizing it.
Can I tell you about a moment when I noticed this happening to someone else? I had a coworker, a really smart guy, brilliant with numbers, and in meetings, he clearly understood everything perfectly. You could see it in his face. But whenever someone asked him a direct question, there was always this long pause before he answered, and his sentences sounded very formal, almost too correct, like something written rather than spoken.
That sounds exactly like someone who was translating carefully instead of speaking naturally.
That's what I thought too. One day after the meeting, I asked him about it. Gently, of course, and he admitted that he always builds his answer perfectly in his first language first, checking the grammar in his head, and only then moves it into English. He said he was scared of making mistakes in front of the team.
That makes so much sense, though. I think a lot of learners translate carefully because they believe one small mistake will make them look less capable.
Right. But ironically, that careful translating process was making him sound less natural, not more professional. I told him what helped me, which was practicing small daily situations directly in English first, without judging the sentence, just letting it come out, mistakes and all.
Did he try it?
He did, actually. He started doing something similar to what you did with your coffee routine. He would describe his commute to work directly in English every morning just for himself. No pressure, no audience. A few weeks later, in another meeting, someone asked him a question and his answer came out faster, more relaxed, and honestly, more like a real conversation than a written report.
That is such a wonderful example because it shows this is not about talent. It is about training a new habit, replacing the translating habit with a direct thinking habit.
Exactly. And I want to be honest with our listeners, this does not disappear overnight. Even now, if I am extremely tired or if the topic is very technical, sometimes my brain wants to jump back to my first language first. It is a very natural habit to fall back on.
I feel the same way. If I'm nervous, that old habit tries to come back, translating carefully instead of speaking directly. But now I recognize it happening and I can slow down, take a breath, and picture the situation directly in English again instead of panicking.
That awareness alone makes such a big difference. Once you notice yourself translating, you can gently guide yourself back to thinking directly in the language.
And I think that is really the heart of today's topic. If our listeners want to speak English naturally in everyday English conversation, the goal is not memorizing more words. It's building this new habit of connecting real situations directly to English, step by step, starting with small, low-pressure moments, just like our coffee routine or your restaurant order.
Exactly. Small daily practice, real situations, direct thinking. That's how learners move from B1 to B2 and start to sound like themselves in English, not like a translation.
Can I tell you what happened after that video call interview, though? Because the story does not end with me feeling frustrated. About a week later, I had a second interview with the same company, and this time I decided to try something different before the call even started. Instead of preparing full sentences in my own language and translating them, I only prepared ideas, just simple pictures in my mind of what I wanted to talk about.
So, no full sentences at all? Just a general idea?
Exactly. I told myself, do not build the sentence first. Just remember the situation and let the English words come out on their own. And when the interviewer asked me almost the same question as before about an unhappy client, this time I did not freeze. I started speaking almost immediately, describing a real situation from a previous job, step by step, the way I would tell a friend about it over coffee.
Did it feel completely different?
Completely. My English was not perfect. I mixed up a verb tense at one point, but the interviewer did not even react to that because the conversation felt natural. She was listening to my story, not judging my grammar. And at the end, she actually smiled and said, "That is a great example. Thank you for sharing that so clearly."
That is such a powerful contrast. The same person, the same language ability, but a completely different result just because you changed your thinking process instead of translating.
That is exactly the lesson I took from it. And I got the job, by the way.
I remember that. You called me right after and you were so excited.
I was, because for the first time, I felt like my English speaking practice had actually worked in a real situation, not just in a classroom or a textbook exercise.
I think that is such an encouraging story for our listeners because a lot of people believe they need to reach a perfect level before they can speak confidently. But really, confidence comes from changing this one habit, thinking directly in English instead of translating first.
Can I ask you something, Jack? After your restaurant experience, did you keep practicing that direct thinking in other everyday situations, or did it only happen naturally sometimes?
Honestly, at first it was only natural in low pressure moments, like ordering food or greeting a neighbor, but I decided to be more intentional about it. So I started what I called my 5-minute rule. Every evening, for 5 minutes, I would pick something simple that happened during my day, and I would describe it out loud, directly in English, without writing it down first, without translating, just speaking.
What kind of things did you describe?
Really ordinary things. One day I described a phone call I had with my internet company about a billing problem. Another day I described a short conversation with my neighbor about her dog who kept barking every morning. It sounds simple, almost boring, but doing this every single day trained my brain to build that direct connection between real experiences and English words.
I love that idea because it takes the pressure away. You are not performing for anyone, you're just practicing quietly, building the habit.
Exactly. And after a few weeks of doing that every evening, I noticed something interesting happen in a real meeting at work. Someone asked me a fairly complicated question about a shipment delay, something with a lot of small details, dates, numbers, different departments involved. And instead of panicking and trying to translate a careful answer, I just told the story the same way I had been practicing every evening, step by step, plainly.
And how did that go?
Really well, actually. My manager told me afterward that she appreciated how clearly I explained the situation. She said it felt easy to follow. And I remember thinking, this is the same skill I practice alone every evening for weeks, just describing my day directly in English.
That connects perfectly to something I want listeners to understand. This is not about becoming fluent overnight. It is about small, repeated practice in real, everyday situations so that when a bigger moment comes, a job interview, an important meeting, a phone call, your brain already has the habit ready.
I agree completely, and I think it also helps to remember that even native speakers pause sometimes. Even native speakers search for the right word sometimes. The goal is not zero pauses ever. The goal is removing that extra unnecessary step of translating everything first, so your natural pauses become shorter and much more comfortable.
That is such an important point because I used to think fluent people never hesitate at all, and that made me feel even more nervous when I hesitated. But once I understood that hesitating is normal and the real problem was translating word for word, everything felt more manageable.
Right. And one more thing I want to mention because I think it will help a lot of our listeners today. Reading and listening in English regularly also helps this habit grow because the more English sentences your brain hears and sees, the more natural patterns it collects and the less it needs to borrow patterns from your first language.
That is very true. I noticed that once I started listening to English podcasts regularly and reading short English articles every day, my direct thinking became easier because my brain had more natural English patterns already stored, ready to use, instead of needing to build them from scratch by translating.
So really, today's lesson connects speaking, listening, and reading all together. They all support this same goal of thinking directly in English rather than translating.
Exactly. And I think our listeners are going to feel very encouraged today because this is something anyone can practice starting today with just a few minutes, describing your morning coffee, your commute, or a small conversation you had directly in English. No translating allowed.
There is actually one more story I want to share because I think it shows how this habit can help even in the most stressful moments, not just interviews or meetings. A few years ago, I was traveling for work, and my flight got delayed for almost 6 hours. I needed to call the airline directly, in English, to ask about rebooking a connecting flight. And I remember feeling my heart rate go up just thinking about making that phone call.
Phone calls are honestly one of the hardest things for a lot of learners because you cannot see the other person's face, and there is no time to think slowly.
Exactly. And normally, in a stressful situation like that, my brain would want to run straight back to my first language, build a careful, polite sentence there, and then translate it under pressure, which usually made me sound even more nervous. But this time, because I had been practicing direct thinking for weeks already, something different happened. When the airline representative answered, I just described my situation the way I had been training myself to do, plainly, step by step. My flight number, the reason for the delay, and what I needed. A new connection before midnight if possible.
And did she understand you right away?
She did, actually, and the whole call took maybe 4 minutes, which felt like a miracle to me at the time. Afterward, I remember standing at the gate thinking, that was the first stressful phone call in English where I did not feel like I was translating in my head the entire time. I was just handling a real problem using English as a tool, not as a puzzle I had to solve first.
I love that description. English as a tool, not a puzzle. I think that is exactly the shift our listeners need to make. Because right now, for a lot of you listening, English might still feel like a puzzle you solve inside your own language first. But the goal, the whole point of today's episode, is to help that puzzle feeling slowly disappear so English becomes something you use directly, the same way you use your first language, without that extra translating step in between.
And I want to be clear with everyone listening. This change does not require you to suddenly become an advanced speaker. Both of our stories today happened while we were still making mistakes, still learning grammar, still building vocabulary. The direct thinking habit is not a reward for reaching a high level. It is actually a tool that helps you reach that higher level faster because it removes so much unnecessary pressure from your brain.
That is such a good way to end this part of our conversation. Both of us used to freeze up. Both of us used to translate word for word. And both of us are still learning, even now. So if today's episode felt personal to you, if you saw yourself in my interview story or in Jack's phone call at the airport, that is exactly the point. Because this challenge exists to help you practice speaking English naturally, one small, real situation at a time.
And honestly, this is exactly what our whole channel is about. Every single day on this 30-day B1 to B2 challenge, we try to give you a little more practice thinking directly in English through real stories, real vocabulary, and real everyday English conversation, not just grammar rules on a page.
Exactly. And that is why we always say this podcast for beginners and intermediate learners is not about memorizing a textbook. It's about building real habits you can actually use. Whether you're ordering food, answering a phone call, or sitting in front of an interviewer, feeling calm, and letting your English come out directly, the way you already think, without translating it first from another language in your head.
I think that is the perfect place to pause our main story for today, and now let's slow down and look closely at some of the expressions we naturally used while we were talking.
Okay, let's slow down now and look closely at some of the expressions we used naturally while we were talking, because you probably understood them already from the story, and now we want to make sure you can use them yourself.
The first one is freeze up. When Rose said she felt like she froze up in her interview, it means your mind suddenly stops working and you cannot speak or think clearly for a moment, usually because of nervousness or pressure. For example, I froze up completely when my boss asked me a question in front of the whole team.
A common mistake learners make is saying, I freezed. But freeze is an irregular verb, so the past form is froze, and with an object, it becomes frozen. So remember, I froze up, not I freezed up. A more natural way to describe the same feeling is, my mind went blank, which means almost the exact same thing.
The next expression is translate word for word. This means changing each word one at a time from your first language into English instead of thinking about the full meaning or the natural way to say something. For example, if you translate word for word, your sentences often sound strange, even if the grammar is technically correct.
A lot of learners think translating word for word is safe because it feels careful and accurate, but actually it usually makes your English sound unnatural, stiff, and slow. A better habit, as we talked about today, is thinking about the whole idea first and then finding the natural English way to say it.
Next, we have think directly in English. Sometimes we also called it direct thinking in today's episode. This means connecting a real situation straight to English words without building a sentence in your first language first. For example, when I ordered food at that restaurant, I was finally thinking directly in English instead of translating my order first.
This one takes practice, and learners sometimes expect it to happen instantly, but it grows slowly through small daily moments like describing your morning coffee or your commute, exactly like we explained earlier in the story.
The fourth expression is mother tongue. Your mother tongue is your first language, the language you learned as a small child, usually from your family. For example, my mother tongue is not English, but I use English every single day at work now.
A small mistake some learners make is saying mother language, which sounds a little strange in this context. Native speakers usually say mother tongue, or you can also say native language, which means the same thing.
Next is hesitant, or the verb hesitate. When you hesitate, you pause before speaking or doing something, usually because you are unsure or nervous. For example, she hesitated for a moment before answering the difficult question.
Learners sometimes confuse hesitate with wait, but hesitate specifically shows uncertainty or nervousness, not just a normal pause. You can hesitate to answer a question or hesitate to make a decision, and both show that same feeling of doubt.
Number 6, picture the situation. This means imagining a scene clearly in your mind, almost like watching a small movie of it. For example, before I answer a question now, I try to picture the situation first instead of building sentences in my first language.
This phrase is really useful for learners because it describes exactly the habit we want you to build today, picturing real life directly and connecting it to English rather than connecting it to your first language first.
Next, we use the idea of English as a tool, not a puzzle. This means treating English as something simple you use to solve a real problem, instead of something complicated you have to figure out first. For example, once I stopped seeing English as a puzzle, phone calls became so much easier for me.
This is more of an idea than a fixed expression, but I think it captures today's whole lesson perfectly, and I hope our listeners remember it every single day this week.
And finally, building a habit or building the habit. This means slowly creating a new, regular behavior through repeated practice until it feels automatic. For example, Rose built the habit of describing her coffee routine directly in English every single morning.
A common mistake is saying make a habit, which sounds a little strange in this context. Native speakers usually say build a habit or develop a habit, especially when talking about learning something new, like a language skill.
Let's talk about a few mistakes B1 learners often make when they translate directly from their first language, because today's topic connects perfectly with this.
The first mistake is saying, I have 25 years, instead of, I am 25 years old. This happens because in many languages, age uses the verb have, but in English, we use the verb be. So remember, I am 25 years old, not I have 25 years.
Another common mistake is saying I am agree instead of I agree. This happens because some languages use a verb similar to be plus agree, but in English, agree is already a full verb by itself, so it is simply I agree or I do not agree without adding am or is.
A third mistake happens with idioms translated directly. For example, a learner might say, it is raining cats and dogs, translated literally from their own language's rain idiom, but that would confuse an English speaker completely because the meaning would not match. It is much safer to say, it is raining very heavily, unless you are already sure the English idiom exists and matches naturally.
And one more common mistake, saying I am boring when you actually mean I am bored. I am boring means other people find you dull or uninteresting, but I am bored means you personally feel lack of interest right now. This small difference ending in ing versus ed changes the whole meaning of the sentence.
These small mistakes usually come from translating grammar patterns directly from your first language, which connects perfectly with everything we talked about today. Thinking directly in English helps you avoid these patterns naturally over time.
One last mistake worth mentioning is word order. In many languages, describing time comes first in a sentence, so learners sometimes say, yesterday at the office I had a problem, which is understandable but sounds a little unnatural in English. A more natural order is usually, I had a problem at the office yesterday, putting the time detail toward the end.
That is such a good example because word order mistakes happen so often when we build a sentence in our first language first and then simply move the words into English one by one without adjusting the natural English order.
Exactly. And that is really the whole message of today's episode. The fewer times you translate directly, the fewer of these small mistakes you will make because you are building sentences the way English naturally works, not copying the pattern from another language.
Now, here is today's comment challenge for all of you listening. Think about a moment when you translated something word for word in your head and it slowed you down or made you feel nervous. Maybe it was a job interview, a phone call, or even a simple conversation with a stranger.
We want you to write a short answer in English in the comments below. Tell us what the situation was, how it felt in that moment, and if you could go back, what would you do differently today using what we talked about in this episode?
Do not worry about writing a perfect sentence. This is exactly the kind of low-pressure practice we talked about today. So just picture the situation and write it directly in English without translating first. We read every single comment, and we love seeing your progress.
Thank you, friends, for listening to our today's episode. I hope you learned something from it. Don't miss tomorrow's episode, day 16 of the B1 to B2 challenge. Subscribe now so you don't fall behind. See you tomorrow, friends.